Hello and welcome to the Surplus Geek podcast. I'm Jake, and today I am joined by Cucumber, who eventually will probably change their name, but everyone knows him as Cucumber. We're going to call him Cucumber. How is it going?
Decent at best. How are you?
Pretty good now that we've got the podcast going again. Um,
Yes,
a little behind the scenes, we've had so many glitches. All right, so we'll start off with the basic question that I totally didn't already ask you. Um,
of course.
what? How did you get into collecting?
Well, it all started probably when I was about 12 years old. Um, really, I think I blame Firebird JP for this. I'm pretty sure I stumbled across one of his videos, and then I wanted a mask myself. I think my first mask was a Phalanx Alpha. It was like some Riot mask as well that I ended up giving away anyway. But yeah, so I guess it kind of started from there. I just had like a small collection going up until I was about 13, 14. And throughout high school, it kind of slowed down. And I didn't really get serious about it again until I was about 17 years old. And then that's when I really started to get into US equipment, protective equipment, gas masks. And only recently I've gotten into chemical munitions, decontamination, really anything to do with the chemical warfare service as well, like the chemical mortar battalions, chemical decontamination companies, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, uh, I think it's funny that we all kind of got into it at the same time in our lives and stuff. I think the funny thing about the Firebird, OG YouTuber, if anyone doesn't know,
Oh yeah.
really like the big gas mask YouTuber back in the day, before everyone else, really. Um, it's funny. I don't know what got me into. I think I just was just one of those weird guys that just happened to be in the military and just was given money. But the so you've done kind of all over the place. Not really all over the place. You've done a couple eras, but what would be your favorite era so far to cover?
Definitely 40s and 50s. I find that era very fascinating with the rate at which the chemical warfare service was developing things, how much our doctrine was changing at the time. I mean, World War II, the early 40s, that was when we, first saw our injection molded face piece with the M2. And then development went into the lightweight series, and you had the snout type surface mask, or excuse me, the assault mask, then the snout type surface mask. And at the same time this was going on, you had the E19 series, which would then become the M9 in 1947. There was just a lot going on in that era, not even with masks, even protective clothing. Since World War One, I believe in World War One we were using a certain type of impregnated clothing. It was using like a rosin material or whatever. Um, it wouldn't be until like the mid 20s to 30s that we had a chloramide compound actually impregnating the clothing. So that saw a little bit of development in the 30s, obviously with uniform change, but it stayed pretty much the same well into the 60s, even the 70s. Uh, Obviously with different compounds impregnating the clothing, but we also saw development with chemical munitions, types of agents we were developing. So there was just a lot going on in this time period as well.
Yeah, it's funny that you say into the 70s because I don't think people realize that like the standard for chemical protective gear for like an infantryman was really just impregnated clothing
Yep.
all the way up until eventually the CPOG comes along in the mid to late 70s. So it's this that yeah, some things change, but basically the basic concepts there that entire time, which is really fascinating when you think about that. Like, because I think a lot of people hear chemical protective gear and they think, those big rubber chemical suits, encapsulated
Oh
suits and
yeah.
stuff. But like, that stuff is like new. That's like new age stuff. I mean, they had tap gear back then, but like for your average infantryman, you really just had the clothes that you're wearing, but like an impregnated version of it, and that's pretty much it. Maybe a hood, but even then, and you watch the old videos that they told the guys the most important part of your kit was your mask.
Yeah.
That was the most important part. If you got it in your skin, you got it in your skin. You're gonna have to deal with it, kind of thing. That and atropine injectors were big by the time the '70s came
Yes.
around.
Well, so speaking of atropine, nerve agents wouldn't really become a part of our doctrine until after World War II because we found stockpiles of German sarin, what we would later call GB agents, as well as Tauben. Um, then we'd obviously developed atropine. But during World War II, we didn't have any sort of nerve agent defense. And then the Germans, they were putting all of their development into developing munitions with nerve agents while we were basically focusing on blister agents. Because a lot of these agents, that's what a lot of people were developing on and were probably would have used. So we were pretty prepared for blister agents, not so much nerve agents. Um, I'm not gonna lie, I just lost my train of thought. So there you go. You can cut that out.
No, you're good. So, I think that no, I get what you're saying because what you're saying basically is the U.S. going into World War II was fighting the last war, literally, because they were planning for like blister agents from the end of World War One, basically,
Oh
and
yeah. Well,
didn't think
I mean,
about future things.
everybody kind of was. I mean, the British, the Russians, even the Germans, because there was a lot of fear left over from World War One with how effective things like chlorine and phosgene were used. Well, now you have things like nitrogen mustard or even normal mustard agents and lewisite that were pretty scary. I mean, if these were used, these would stay in the field for up to weeks at a time, especially mustard. So really developing something like decontamination doctrine was super important had they been used. It wasn't like a non-persistent gas, which what that is when it's deployed, it pretty much dissipates within minutes. But
Hmm.
that's not what mustard would be. So let's say you're at an artillery battery, you get an attack from mustard gas. Well, I mean that battery is pretty much out of commission until you can clean it up. So things like that were really important for development, and nerve agents wouldn't really be on the radar of the United States Chemical Warfare Service doctrine until after World War II. Like I said, with the Germans and their developments of nerve agents, we had no way of detecting it or even fighting it in World War II.
Yeah, that's actually kind of scary when you think about it. That we were just pretty much blind to an entire element to what we nowadays would call CBRN, but
Yeah.
and then to add into that mix, we also had the atomic aspect of post World War
Oh
II, where
yes.
it's like now we got to worry about this and that. Because I always find that fascinating that that really like opened up the eyeballs of the like, oh, we got to worry about radiological impact as well.
Another really big thing that came up during World War II was biological agents. The Japanese were really known for using biological warfare, especially in the Chinese, not only using chemical warfare, but we had put a little bit of development into biological defense as well. We had our own detector kits in World War II. They had field detector kits that came in a big box, and you would take field samples. And you would send it off to a lab, and you'd have to wait pretty much to see if there was anything out there like anthrax or something. uh, so that was also an aspect, and that really became a bigger thing in the 50s, just like with radiological stuff. Now, while we didn't have anything protective per se, we started developing, um, radiac sets or, uh, oh god, Geiger counters, things like that.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I know like from watching old training films, they also like because like you said, there's not really much you can do in a radiological situation. But like telling
Yeah,
guys, if you can find a hole, get in the hole. If you could dig
pretty
a
much.
hole, dig a hole. Do something to put if you have to cover up all your exposed skin if an atomic bomb's gonna go off, all that stuff comes out, and they start. It's not really. I mean, even I hate to say it, but even nowadays, there's not really much that we have in the way of preventing radiological effects because chemical protective gear only protects you so much.
Hmm.
Depend. Especially gamma, you're screwed with gamma. But so
Yeah.
yeah, I definitely agree with you. It's that it's I said it before, but it's the renaissance of like really getting into chemical, biological, and I guess radiological. You know, how many times that acronym has changed because we
A
had
lot.
ABC, CBR, CBRN now, NBC for a
Hmm.
while. CBRN is also now CBRN with an E. So, and yeah, us Americans do say CBRN. Just got to point that out. Um, I don't know why we just like to say our acronyms out loud. So, not NBC. NBC is just NBC. They don't say
Oh yeah.
Nabus or something like that. So you mentioned the M9. Uh, I also have a fondness for the M9. Um, you'd want to just go into that a little bit. You don't have to go crazy, but
Yeah, I won't lie. I'm not too well knowledgeable about the actual development of the N9 series. Obviously, around 1943 is when we really started developing. We needed something lighter weight. And the doctrine of this time period, which is where the E6 or the M5 assault or Army Combat Service mask would come from, we needed a lighter weight mask for amphibious landings. That's kind of where the whole E19 stems from, is a lightweight assault mask. Now, obviously, we didn't develop or we couldn't finalize it during World War II, so we had a stopgap solution. That's kind of what the E6 would be while we developed the M9. And what that kind of turned into was, oh, well, now it's our protective mask for pretty much everyone to use, not even just assault troops. It By the time the M9 was introduced in 1947, it didn't really see any production, or at least as far as I can tell, in 1950 or so, 1951. is when it would really replace all other service masks. But and it would be, I mean, it would be the standard service mask well into the late 50s until the M17 was finalized. But that rapid development I was talking about kind of slowed down after the war. We had the M9. Shortly after, we would start developing the M17 sometime in the early 50s or so. Wouldn't be finalized until 1959. Uh, but so the M9 is a great mask. It's taken a lot of the aspects that we had with our normal service mask from World War II, all the good things, and then putting them all in one mask. And now we have this one protective mask that pretty much replaces all of them.
Yeah, it's the thing about the M9 is it really is a revolution in design compared to the hosed mask from before. It kind of brings everything together. It gives you one solid. It really set in motion. It's funny because the M17 is this complete deviation of what the M9 was. It
Yeah.
a lot different. You had to change doctrine because now you didn't just have a quick change filter on the side, and you had to think things a little bit differently. It's funny how we went through the M17. The M17 served for a while to then go back to a side mounted canister filtered mask later on with the M40, and then we again walk away from that design again to go with the M50, which is kind of M17 like in a way. It's sort of just external instead of internal filters. I
Yeah.
always find that kind of funky that we keep jumping between these concepts. Um,
Well, especially around this time period, it was kind of an organic development because of what the Chemical Warfare Service was doing. They were trying to stay ahead of pretty much everybody else. You know, what else can we develop? How can we be better? That's where the M9 stemmed from. And then later on, it was like, oh, well, what if we made a streamlined mask, internal cheek pockets for the filters? You didn't have an external canister to worry about uh, for a field protective mask, and that's kind of where that idea stemmed from. Is we need to be better than everybody else. So they developed the M17, and that mindset kind of shot us in the foot because if you recall, the XM29, XM40 series didn't. It took pretty much from the 70s all the way to the late 80s before we got anything out of that.
yeah,
Because the M17 started showing its age a little bit too much later on. It wasn't very modular, and to find a mask to do it all was very hard to do. I mean, at this point, we were still using the M9 for toxicological agent protective gear, rocket refueling gear, things like that.
yeah. Anything specialty, the M9 stuck around. You couldn't beat it. I mean, they were even making those new filters for the M9 into the
Oh yeah.
80s to fill that role. And it sucks because I like I said, I like the M17, but from a warfighter standpoint, I really don't know what the military was thinking. Because if the cheek filter meant you could shoulder a rifle better, I would be totally for it. But I don't find the M17 to be easy to shoulder a rifle with. So
Well,
eh,
I was gonna say with that, I'd say that's a little bit better than having to produce two different masks.
yeah,
Now the M9, it's insanely easy to shoulder a rifle with the M9 just because of how flat the cheek is. But with the M17, it was okay, but it was ambidextrous, so you had that going for it.
that's true.
Uh,
Yeah,
and also with the doctrine of changing filters, this wasn't an entirely new concept. I mean, only recently we had the lightweight series with fixated filters that you had to take off physically anyway. You couldn't do that in the field. That's a point a lot of people bring up that doesn't even really matter,
hmm
um, because the filter fixed on the M9, the M11 was pretty much semi-permanent. You didn't take it off unless you needed to, so it's kind of a moot point. I think
yeah,
in that
that's
aspect.
true. I can understand. I just think I specifically think once you get late into the M17's lifetime, specifically Desert Storm,
Oh yeah.
like because from a practical standpoint, modern day at least, when we were training, and most of my training on that actually has to do with not my actual unit. It was that hazmat unit that I was part of. We had
Mhm.
pappers, so there was a whole different level of consideration with pappers and filter change. Now we weren't changing our filters all the time because we were in training, but the
Of
idea
course.
was every time we came back, we were going to change out our filters because not only we would if it was in a real situation because of the you're pulling air through this filter constantly with a papper, so you're saturating it much quicker. So like, and you're only on a work cycle of maybe 20 minutes, like 20 to 30 minutes max. Like you're not out there for more than that because you have guys ready to cycle in for you and stuff. Work
Yeah.
rest cycles are important. So I don't know. It's interesting going from yeah, you're right though. With the lightweight series, all the early masks, you actually had to send it back. It wasn't something that the average guy would just flip out his filter. It had to, it was a process to it. And
Mhm.
then you go into modern day nowadays. I mean, it's it's supposed to, again, it's supposed, there's a time, you're supposed to keep up on this stuff. I don't even know how it would be implemented with the M50 because that's something that we don't even train on. We don't even talk about or didn't talk about when I was in. I'm like, how often? Because I honestly don't think the military honestly thinks about it because it's just like if a weapon is being, if you have to use your field protective mask in a combat situation, it's already bad. You're
Yeah.
already in bad territory. You can't even evac people. You can't cast evac. Can't do any of that. So I don't even know if that's even a consideration. Honestly, now I think about it, I just think I don't know. But yeah, you have a good point. That is a good point. That is kind of. I just know that that's a common criticism of the M17, and it does suck to take the filters out of the M17. So
It is. It's not the greatest thing in the world to do, and what made it even worse is pretty much every time you use it, you had to replace the filters before you went into the field. Especially if you were expecting blood agents, um, the filters wouldn't last that long against blood agents to begin with. But let's say you don't have a fresh set, well, you have even less time now because the charcoal in there doesn't last forever, and that's with a lot of other filters as well.
yeah, that's true. Yeah, and I don't know if the pork chop, the small, I don't know if it's because of the how it saturates the filter, because that's something that I always wondered is, you look at a canister style filter, it's a circle, you're just pulling things through.
Hmm.
But with the pork chop, it's kind of elongated in a fashion that I wonder how much coverage that top portion of charcoal gets in protection. It's getting way into the weeds there, but it's just something to think about. I don't know.
Yeah, and that's something I haven't really looked into, but just from outside observation, it has so much surface area that parts of the filter get saturated slowly, and so you get more life out of the canister. Obviously, it wasn't as bad because we used it. I can't see it being worse than the M11 canister if I had to guess.
No,
But
no
the
way. It
aspect
it
of
has to
changing,
be. Yeah, I was gonna say it has to be at least effective enough that they kept the
yeah,
mask in service for 30. Well, but yeah, 30 years. Yeah,
yeah,
over 30 years because it goes into the 90s because it took so
hmm
long for the M40 production to get going. So yeah, that's a good point. The other thing I wanted to focus on because you've covered this quite a bit is chemical protective gear, the clothing, the equipment. It, you've done TAP, you've done kind of that vesicant style protected, overgarment or
hmm
impregnated. Um, how is it getting into that? Because I find the impregnated gear to be interesting because it's just so many components. Everything is protect. Even underwear is like
oh
a
yeah.
part of it.
Well, so the impregnated clothing, because if you look at a lot of other countries, like the Soviets were doing what the Germans had and what the British had. I take that back. I believe they had their own impregnated clothing. I don't know too much about the British, but the
Same.
Russians and the Germans, they had these rubber suits. Well, the advantages of impregnated clothing was you could just have a standard combat uniform and issue it to everybody. Um, the only thing you would need to do, obviously, is do the actual impregnation. It comes with its disadvantages. It's not waterproof, and any large droplets of agents you got on you would pretty much make it useless anyway. But it was very good for vapors. Let's say you were in a mustard attack or something. If you got splashed with mustard gas on your chest, well, it'll probably go through the clothing. But if you were just running through vapors, it wouldn't affect you. It also allowed air to flow through, so you weren't as hot in your
Yeah.
protective gear. And then, of course, your underwear. That was really important. So I have a manual, and it shows a lot of graphic imagery of the effects of mustard gas on the skin and underwear and the crotch region. I've seen the photos. I wouldn't want. I'm very glad that they decided it was a good idea to cover up that with
Yeah.
a protective underwear as well. But I mean, this is pretty much basically World War One technology. We didn't really develop a new impregnating compound until I want to say the late 20s, early 30s. But it pretty much stayed the same, changing with the uniform all the way up into the 70s. I mean, the CPOG wasn't even standard whenever it came out. It was still a special issue item. Um, and we were still using impregnated clothing, even in the 90s, technically, with our impregnated underwear for toxicological agent protective gear. But in World War II, you had so many uniforms. You had the wool uniform, HPT uniform, the khaki uniform, the flannel, and all of that. This is that doctrine chain I was talking about. Post war, immediately after, all it got narrowed down to you had your standard combat uniform that was impregnated, didn't have any special modifications. You had your cold wet environment uniform, which was just the M1951 impregnated, or so I assume. It doesn't state if it was a standard a special suit or if it was the 1951 gear, but I digress. And then your cold dry, and it was very simplified. And that pretty much the 50s is what would be the mainstay of our protective uniform. Like I said, well into the 1970s, but this technology was nothing new.
Yeah, and just really, even in the 70s, the Seabog's a weird development history, but the they didn't even really put a lot of focus on that protective gear for the average dude. It was just the mask and just have a mask on. Um, and they just it it's weird that like it took and there's a lot like you said there's actually a lot of advantages to the impregnated clothing versus say a charcoal suit that is kind of become the standard or at least for the US military and just it's just your standard issue uniform. There's nothing special to so there's nothing changing to you. You're not putting something over your uniform. I mean a lot of guys run their suits naked basically because it's so hot wearing a CPOG or BDO or J
Mhm.
list any of those. I mean, that's going to change. I know whatever how we say UIPE. I don't know, UP or yippee. I know that's going to change things into the future. It's supposed to be better. We'll see. Um, but yeah, I always found it. I found it interesting learning about it and stuff, and how it really is. Even having pregnation for your boots. Um,
Yeah.
like just everything. That's before. Because again, it's even gloves. We didn't have like rubber chemical gloves until the late 70s. That's when that I mean for standard issue at least that's
Right.
really when it starts to show up. Before that you had basically special and they're impregnated gloves as well, right? They just like
Yeah.
a
I mean, really, even because the odds of you having permeable protective gloves in the field is pretty low.
yeah
So another development was the M5 ointment that could pretty much be used in place of gloves and in place of a hood. Uh, in the 40s, obviously you had the wool hood, but later on in the late 40s, early 50s, I mean, the combat uniform didn't even have a protective hood. You would just take your M5 ointment and rub it on the exposed areas of your head and neck. And if you didn't have gloves, you just rub it on your hands and you were fine. Now, it was good for blister agents. I can't really say so for nerve agents. That isn't really touched upon in the doctrine at that time.
interesting. It's just funny to think about nowadays, just not even close. It'd just be you'd be
Yeah, no,
gloves,
not at all.
full gloves. You'd have your over boots on, obviously your J list, and then your mask. I mean, you just go full tilt on that stuff. And
Mhm.
back then they're like, you got ointment, just put it on your body, you're good to go. Put your mask on, get back
Yeah.
in the fight.
Well, and so that was another advantage. You didn't have to put on an entire suit for protection. Um, and I would argue its protective capabilities, but I mean, there's a lot of documentation of the Army's development, with the different compounds we use, the M5 ointment itself. It seemed to be pretty good for as long as we used it. Like I said, even in the 60s with the M17, it was pretty much the same as the 50s.
Yeah, and the M17, I don't know the history of the M6 hood, but like you don't see the M6 early on with the M17. It really doesn't come until very late. I feel like the late 60s is when they started to kind of issue out the M6 hoods and they started becoming standard affair.
Well, and so that was another change in our doctrine because when the M17 came out, its protective hood was still in development. It was the E33 chemical biological protective hood, and this is kind of a guesstimate. I don't really see the M6 coming out until like around 1962, 1963. So there was a time period where the M17 just didn't have a hood. And even still, it wasn't really standard until the mid 60s. And even in Vietnam, you don't see them being issued a whole lot.
Yeah, Vietnam, I feel like it's not I I know I've seen it. I just can't think, but I'm pretty sure not until like 69, 70. So like we're talking late into the war. And I mean, by that point, the XM28 started to kind of filter its way in to be used as the tunnel rat kind of role for mass and stuff. It's kind of all over the place. But yeah, you're right. Because if you think about Way City and stuff, the Marines are just wearing M17s, no hoods, nothing.
Well, and with that, they weren't really expecting anything crazy from the Viet Cong. I mean, the only
That's
thing
true.
we had been doing was tear gas. So why would you issue an entire protective uniform and a hood if you didn't need it?
That's true. That's a good point. Yeah. And it's funny to think about too, because now when you think of the M17, at least for me, I think of the hood because Desert
Hmm.
Storm, it really cements that. It's really weird to think that there's an alternate universe where the M40 got actually produced in a high enough numbers to be issued, and it's the face of Desert Storm instead of the M17, which is it's just I don't know. It's weird to think about. Um, yeah, and then the other side of chemical protective gear, which the most fascinating side of my, well, I don't know, it's hard to say. I like tap gear. I love tap gear. I think the history of tap gear is very interesting because it really doesn't change. Well, when did tap gear come into service? Like the 50, like mid 50s?
We estimate around 1953 because that's when it's first mentioned in a manual. And then the M4 hood to follow shortly after in like 1954 or something,
Yeah, and it stays the same basically until the
pretty much.
90s, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, with slight modifications with the buttons, the underwear changed, but pretty much besides boots, nothing really changed throughout the 50s and 60s and 70s.
Yeah, it's crazy to think about that. I mean, I know in you get into the 90s, when you get into the late era of the tap, the 90s, it gets really funky because that's when,
Yeah.
well, that's when the civilian side of things starts to seep a little bit more into for protective gear for the military because when we were doing our training on the hazmat stuff, they did a whole like history of for modern day response, and it was like there's considered like pre 9/11 and post 9/11
Mhm.
for response and the levels of how we handle things and what gear. Because before there wasn't really a plan before 9/11. They basically were just starting to figure it out in like 98, 99. And one of the things that was coming up in 98, 99 was, do we stick with the current issue? I mean, you had the ITAP, which I don't even know if the ITAP ever really went anywhere. But they had the tap gear was starting to slowly become showing its age, and they're like, there's all these new designs. Encapsulated wasn't technically new, because there's what the M5 encapsulated suit. It's kind of like a encapsulated suit, but
Okay.
I can't remember. But probably getting that wrong. But it's that interesting era where like tap was that good for that long that there was no reason to change it until the new millennium. I mean that's when you think about it, it's kind of insane because things change so rapidly. I mean, how many things changed between the 50s and 2000? You went
A
from the
lot.
M1 to the Pasget. You went from no body armor usually to always body armor to actually plate carriers by the end of the 90s to having
Sure.
plates. I mean, plates weren't new, but so I just Tap Gear. I know you've done quite a bit on Tap Gear. Um, you have a video on Tap Gear too. You got quite a few photos of Tap Gear.
Yeah, I've gotten a few things wrong in that video. I need to go back and
I
do some
mean,
updated videos.
it's how it goes. You can't win.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, if it ain't broke, it's just one of those things. What else could we have done better? It was just a big rubber suit thick enough to protect against the heaviest, you know, mustard gas, which is probably one of the worst things you could have gotten on you besides rocket fuel, which was a whole separate ensemble. It was just one of those things.
Yeah, I don't know. Tap Gear is just one of those things where I look at it and it's unique in its design. I think when people think of chemical protective gear, they think of something like a big giant rubber suit.
Hmm.
And like we just said earlier, it's actually just your standard issue gear basically impregnated, which is completely and even more so again, how often would that stuff even been used? I mean, again, just probably mask and the M5 ointment, like you said. That's probably about it.
Yeah, basically. I mean, unless you were like in World War II, I believe even on D-Day, there were some instances where protective clothing was issued that was impregnated because they were almost kind of expecting the Germans to use gas, even though they didn't ultimately. But unless, like in Korea, that I don't really think there was a high threat of chemical agents like there was in World War II. Um, so the odds of it being issued anyway was pretty low. I mean, you had your masks, obviously, but that was basically standard equipment at that time.
Yeah, and the M5, what was standard with most kits, just
Yeah, so the kit itself, standard came with the M5 ointment whenever
yeah.
it was issued, um, and then of course you had your atropine later on with the M5A1, which I don't really know a timeline. It seems to come around the early 50s, early to mid 50s, but I can't really tell. No, definitely early 50s because it's mentioned in a an earlier manual.
And Apitrine is for nerve agents, right?
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
it's pretty interesting.
I don't know the exact science behind it, but the receptors that respond to nerve agents, the atropine will, I guess, adhere itself to it and prevent nerve agents from adhering to it. I don't know. I'd have to look into it
Yeah, it's
again,
like a
but
blocker almost. Yeah,
it's like, and it's like an antidote also.
yeah. So
There's a There's videos, you can find them on YouTube where they're injecting or they're exposing animals like goats and rabbits to nerve agents, and then they just shoot them up with atropine and they're fine.
You gotta love the old you gotta love the
Oh
old
yeah.
animal
Oh yeah.
testing and stuff. My favorite thing is that rabbits were used as sniffers when they would go around chemical munitions and stuff. They'd use a rabbit in a
Really?
cage. Yeah, you can find videos of them with a white rabbit because there always has to be a white rabbit, and because rabbits are so sensitive to change and smell, uh, they'll they'll detect that there's a leak, and they actually will pull like move them around the chemical munitions to see if there's any leaks and stuff. And that was done well into the 70s. There was
That's very
a
interesting.
there's a I can't remember what news agency, but some news agency did a video on chemical stuff because I think it was the late 60s, early 70s. The army accidentally killed a bunch of sheep. If it was
Oh
either
geez.
Army or Air Force, they dropped a munition and it ended up the wind pattern changed, shifted over someone's farm, it killed all their
Oh,
sheep,
I
and there
see.
was a whole thing went on, and they did a report on it. And I remember watching the video, and next thing you know, this guy's walking around in tap gear with a rabbit in a cage, and it's just like moving it around the munitions and stuff in this warehouse. And I'm like, what is going on? So that's apparently a thing. And as a rabbit owner, I'm like, man, rabbit's got a bad deal.
Oh
Um,
yeah, a whole lot of testing went on with rabbits and goats in the 40s and 50s. I mean, there was a whole I forget what it's called, but there was a whole operation where they just took a bunch of goats and rabbits and put them in a bunker, and then they shot nerve agent munitions at it. Um, and then some of them were in protective, I guess, encasements, and some weren't. And I think what they were demonstrating was as long as you were protected and you got hit by a nerve agent in a bunker, you were fine. And because of its non-persistency, I think they even went in after a while without protective gear, and they were
oh, to
fine.
prove, yeah.
Yeah.
My favorite is when they set up like goats and pigs and stuff in the atomic testing, and they're like, "We're gonna see what happens," and it's like it doesn't take a genius to know if you put it within its blast radius that you're just gonna have nothing. Like, I never because that I remember like watching an old documentary on it, and they were like, and they were gone. There was nothing left, and it's like, yes, because you put them inside the blast, you knew what was gonna happen. That was such a
Yeah,
waste of.
incinerated, yes.
Yeah, it was just not sure what the plan there was. So future, what's your future plans? Gear, uniforms, such.
Well, I'm currently in the process of joining a living history organization up in New Jersey, at Sandy Hook. They're and what they do, they have the old artillery batteries over there. They kind of upkeep everything. Um, I'm currently in the process of joining that, so I'd like to, I guess, gear all of my collecting towards the 245th Coastal Artillery Battalion, as well as maintaining the chemical weapons aspect of it. This next year, hopefully, the plan is to go back up there. Older Mask is up there as well. I met up with him back in October, and we did a little something. It's on my Instagram, but we did a little mock decontamination of the 6-inch gun up there. But the hope is to have working decontamination apparatuses, have a real gas drill, and then go in with protective gear and then decontaminate the gun in front of, like, I don't know, an audience, hopefully. But that's kind of, I guess, the future at this point. I'm kind of in the same boat as you. I moved away from just masks. I pretty much have everything I need. It's just more so getting all of the field gear, detector equipment, decontamination related items. I've even gotten into chemical mortar related items as well. So just kind of broadening my scope.
Yeah, yeah, that's actually that sounds really cool. I'm looking forward to that. Yeah, on Instagram, I remember you guys you posting the decontamination of the artillery piece. That was a good set.
Oh yeah,
Um,
that was a good day.
and
Yeah.
everyone wants to follow you on Instagram. Your Instagram is
CWS.history 1944.
there. You go. You're not chemical cucumber anymore. You've moved on,
I'm
moved up.
tired of being the cucumber.
I mean, I can get it. I can understand it. Although I think you might have been able to work it into. I get it though. I get it. You
No,
don't want to be
I have no
associated
problem
with it.
with it. I was just, I guess, I get it was stagnant. I don't want to say tired of it, but I just wanted something new.
No, I totally
I,
understand.
if you still call me cucumber, I don't care. That's what I'm
Yeah.
known as at this point.
But it's one of those. I get it because Surplus Geek. I crafted Surplus Geek to be the name, and it's a great name, and I love the name. But it's one of those things where it's like I'm stuck on this. I'm stuck on the logo. I'm stuck on the So it is who I am for the future, and I guess I'm okay with it. But no, I totally get trying to the rebranding almost to try to really focus in and stuff. But that's cool. I like the idea of the living history thing. I mean, that's something that I always wanted to do reenacting, but I just do not have the time, the effort, or the hair to do reenacting at the moment. So,
Yeah.
and real quick, what uniform are you currently wearing? Because you are
I am, well, currently,
dressed the part.
drip check. The Ike uniform, just standard Ike jacket. This one's dated 44. I managed to find one that fits me. And then I just have some 18-ounce surge pants on.
Nice.
And then I've got the chemical warfare service pin on it as well.
Awesome. That's pretty cool. Yeah. There's something about the 40s uniforms that just, you know.
Well, they look sharp. I like it. Probably one of my favorite looking uniforms from the 40s. Although the normal dress tunic does look very nice as well.
Yeah, it's funny that we went back to a more similar style with the current new
I'm
service
so happy
uniform.
we did that. The pinks and greens, as they call it.
Yeah. I'm mad
Oh yeah,
because I got out before we got those.
man. But they look so sharp. Just the sharp looking uniform.
I can't imagine. We used to do the infantryman's ball, and you know, everyone shows up in their dress uniform and stuff, and I just can't imagine what it looks like now. With because I know some guys probably still wear the ASUs, which
Mhm.
the Army service uniform's okay. It's not terrible. It's just it's simple. There's not much to it. The pinks and greens just because they harken back to that classic era, and everyone thinks Band of Brothers style. You know, they
Oh
brought
yeah,
back the Ike jacket too. There is an
they
Ike
did.
style jacket, so you can do yeah. It's just
And
there's just something about it. There's just something about and there's no beret with it. That's the key. I don't like the beret.
didn't they brought back the side caps, didn't they?
I'm pretty sure, yeah. And
Yeah.
it's just berets can be really cool. They can look really good. The problem is that you have to form your own beret, and a lot of people don't know how to form a beret, including myself. So they end up looking bad. And if you ever need to get another beret, you have to do the whole process over again, and you also have to shave them. The first thing you do is you shave your beret because there's all this like the material's all fuzzy and stuff. So you take your razor blade, you know, your shaving razor, and you just shave it. That's something I had to do. That was fun. I had to do it twice. Um, yeah, and there's a way to fold it, and you know because it's just this like chef hat thing going on when you first get it. You actually have to you got to fold it so it fits on your head, right? And then you have to there's a way to when you take it off to fold it so that way you can store it. So there's a whole process that, and I feel like it's just too much work compared to a simple garrison cap or a just field service cap thing, you know, anything else. I mean, the army and hats is just it's a weird history. I don't like the patrol cap either. The patrol cap always looked weird. It doesn't really sit in your head right. The Marines got hats right. I hate to say it, but the Marines got their hats right with the 8 points. You know,
Oh yeah.
it just you know that or the Rangers Ranger roll your patrol cap. That's another. That looks great. Rangers got it right too. But I think we will call that it for the podcast. I want to, you know, this is a good first episode for season 3. Hopefully, I have more than 7 episodes this year. I want to thank you for coming on. It was fun
Thanks for
talking to
having
you.
me.
You're a guest that I should have had on a long time ago. I apologize for that.
You're good.
But if you want to learn more about this type of stuff, your Instagram is a really good place to go. You're really knowledgeable. You do a lot of good research. You're one of the highly respected research people in the community. So,
Don't inflate my head too much.
well, it's
Just
true.
sure.
Well, you
But
focus more too. So you like I'm broad. I hit things on a more broad standpoint. So you
mhm.
focus more. So you have a lot better understanding of things than I ever could because I'm jumping from scene to scene here, going mad. But with that, we'll sign off. I hope everyone enjoyed this episode. Come back. I'm gonna try to keep to the 2 week schedule. So come back in 2 weeks, I guess. Hopefully there's an episode. And thanks for coming on, Cucumber. And that's it.
Thank you.